I want to come back to an April 1 memo where Seward proposed that America declare war on France. I'm a Frenchman, so he wanted to declare war on my country to reunite your country. I cannot help noticing a parallel with what we are living at the moment, an administration right now that is picking up economic fights with virtually every trading partner on earth. Is it the same playbook? Use foreign confrontation to consolidate domestic power? Or do you see that as different from what we see today?
Completely different. This wasn't a new thought on April 1st. The memo, this famous memo he writes to the president, he had been talking about trying to pick fights, not start a war. There's a difference. Pick fights to change the subject.
If you're tired of arguing with strangers on the internet, try talking with one of them in real life.
Welcome to Back in America, the podcast.
William Henry Seward was supposed to be president. He was the leading Republican, the favorite for the 1860 nomination. He lost to Abraham Lincoln. And then, while Lincoln said nothing for 4 months, Seward tried to stop the Civil War, alone from the Senate floor. This is the story almost nobody knows. To start this conversation, even, I would love for you to just maybe close your eyes and take me back to Cornell. We are in the 70s. You are an undergraduate and something happened. And William Henry Seward gets into your head, and 50 years later is still into your head. So what happened? What was it?
I've been very fortunate in my life in many ways, but one of them was when I was undergraduate at Cornell. I studied with two of the greatest historians in the country, if not the world. And Seward was really at the confluence of both of their interests. One man was a man named Joel Silby, who was the leading political historian of what's called the middle period of American history, which centers on the period right before, right during, and right after the Civil War. And of course, Seward is critically important as a political figure in that time period. And the other gentleman was a man named Walter Lefebvre, who was the country's leading diplomatic historian. And he was interested in Seward more for the fact that Seward literally had an intellectual construct. He literally was the architect who thought out America's expansion, not just to the Pacific Ocean, but to Asia. And in a number of speeches he gave when he was a senator in the Senate, U.S. Senate in the early 1850s, he actually laid out this vision of how we were going to go across, not just to San Francisco and Los Angeles, but to Japan and China, etc. And so he's the man who bought the Guano Islands, which were to be used as coaling stations for our ships to go to Asia. He bought Midway Island. He bought Alaska. That's what he's probably most famous for. Mm-hmm. At the same time he was buying Alaska, he also, and this is somewhat relevant for things we're talking about today, he was also trying to buy Greenland. So buying Greenland, which is not a new idea in 2026, that was around in 1867. He also had a vision to build the Panama Canal, and also to buy a number of islands in the Caribbean to make the Caribbean an American, not ocean, but basically a lake. So he didn't live to see all of these things done in his lifetime, but the architecture that he envisioned is in fact what happened. So these two men, to your question, really sparked my interest in this really incredible fellow that's been really lost to history, principally because Americans, and I think this is true of most people in Western civilization, I can't speak to Eastern civilization, but in Western civilization, we tend to have this fixation on the winners. Mm-hmm. And we tell history through the eyes of the winners. Mm. And of course, the ultimate winner in American history is Abraham Lincoln, our greatest president. who's probably had somewhere between 10 and 15,000 books written about him. And there's still scores of books being written over and over again. Not too much new to say about him, although there's some new stuff in my book that's said about him. So here is Seward, who was the leading Republican in the country, was the presumptive favorite to become the Republican nominee in 1860. He lost for a couple of strange reasons. Then he becomes Secretary of State. But my book focuses on this really untold story about what he did to try to save the Union.
You were introduced to Seward at the time from your teachers, but I'm sure you've been introduced to millions of people during your studies. What stuck with you to be so interested with this man who, as you said, was not a winner? So what was it that really sparked your interest with this man?
Well, again, I think he is a winner. He's not recognized because he's standing in the shadow of Lincoln, if you will. But he was one of the most important secretaries of state in our history. He was an incredibly consequential politician. As I say,
at the time, you could see that.
Yes.
At the very early days, you already, okay. You spent 40 years as one of the top securities lawyer in New York, right? You
47.
argued case 47. All right. Thank you. You argued cases, you built narrative, you cross-examined witnesses. How did this training really help you in the way you do history?
That's a great question, because a lot of people write history from a pre-existing bias. And I've done a lot of reading of history. I could spot that a mile away. And one of the things that these two gentlemen taught me, and I'll circle back to how my legal training helps in this regard, is you cannot write history based upon what you know happened. In other words, we know there was a civil war. We know the North won. But people in 1859 didn't know there was going to be a civil war. And people at the beginning of 1861 had no idea who was going to win this civil war. In fact, as late as 1864, it looked like the North was going to lose the Civil War. So you have to strip out this hindsight bias. Hindsight is 2020, where, of course the North was going to win. No, of course there's going to be civil. No, people did not know that. And so you have to write history without this bias, this hindsight bias. And where my training as a lawyer, particularly a trial lawyer, helps in this regard is I'm focused on the evidence. And I think you've read the book, the footnotes, the endnotes, whatever you want to call them, are, shall we say, pretty voluminous. I've done all the work. I've looked at all the evidence, which is what a lawyer does. I didn't come and say, I'm only going to look at evidence that supports the view that Seward's a great guy, or that Lincoln's a great guy, or Lincoln was always right. I'm just going to look at the evidence and lay out the evidence as it exists, having looked at all the evidence. So having looked at all the evidence, this book is the product of that process. Again, without the bias of knowing how things turned out. Because again, Stewart was operating on this, in this period, trying to avoid a civil war. He thought that was a distinct possibility. That didn't turn out to be right for reasons that are set forth in my book, but he didn't know that in December of 1860.
And yet, many historians, Burlingame, Hamilton, really don't have many kind words to say about Seward. They call him appeasement, a profound moral defect. What else? Incredible blindness.
Yes.
So all those are respectable historians. So what is it you saw that they didn't see?
Again, they're writing, those gentlemen are writing history from Lincoln's perspective. Mr. Burlingame, I have great respect for, because I think his 2-volume work, and this, I say this in my book, I think is a great treatise on Lincoln, but it has a Lincoln bias to it. And so he comes at this from that perspective. I'm not coming at this with a bias. Mr. Hamilton is a British historian who really doesn't know that much about American history. And he didn't do any original research like Mr. Burlingame did. So I put Mr. Hamilton in a different category. And some of these other historians back from a prior era, when they use the word appeasement, those people were writing, those very distinguished historians, and I lay out everything that they've said in my book. They were writing in the context of World War II, when appeasement had a very charged word, that trying to come to terms with Hitler was like, how can you come to terms with the devil? And so they were writing with that context at the time. Now, people, when I talk about this book and they bring up things that you're talking about right now, the moral defect or appeasement or whatever, people don't really understand American history insofar as how terrible it is to try to compromise with the people in the southern states who owned slaves. Well, America was founded by a compromise with people who owned slaves. It's in the Constitution. The Missouri Compromise, which kept the country together in 1820, that was a compromise with the slave owners. The Compromise of 1850, similarly, was a compromise with the slave owners. So there are lots of compromises in our history with the slave owners. Even Lincoln did not think the slave owners were evil. He said at the time, he said, I don't blame them for slavery. That's the economic system they grew up with, and that they didn't have a choice in the matter. That was something that their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers put in place. It's not their fault. I'm not passing moral judgment on them. And that's Lincoln saying that. I think we need to be a little careful about this moral high hat that some people think, compromise is bad in all contexts, or in this context, compromising with the people who own slaves. There were lots of compromises in our history before that. And this was in a very important effort to save democracy, our form of government, the only government in the world at this point where majority rule was the concept. And that was what it was at issue from Lincoln's standpoint in trying to save the Union. That this is Lincoln saying, if we don't save this fragile form of government, then majoritarian rule is just an experiment that has failed.
Yeah.
So that's what Seward was trying.
And just to be clear for the listener, when you talk about putting a moral judgment on it, you are not looking at it from the lens of someone living in 2026. You are really looking at it as a historian with the fact and the experience of the time.
Correct. Yeah. That's what I'm saying. This hindsight bias, of course, it's, I'm not making excuses for or saying, wasn't it great that we made these compromises with slaves?
No.
That's just a historical, those are historical acts. And when people in the 1850s were looking at this, they understood that they saw that slavery was in our Constitution.
Sure.
It's written in our Constitution, and they knew that. They understood that. That was true. The Northerners knew that, and the Southerners knew that. So the people who are radical abolitionists, for example, in the North, they condemned the Constitution. They thought the Constitution was a horrible thing because it embodied slavery.
So let me step back a minute and looking at your work. Your first book was Myron Taylor. It's the story of the CEO of U.S. Steel, who became FDR's secret envoy to the Vatican.
Yes,
and
sir.
now you're talking about Stewart, another powerful American working behind the scene at a moment of national crisis. Is there a pattern in the story that really attracts you?
So what really attracts me to both those books, and my next book, which I just sent to the publisher, is telling a story in history that's never been told before. Taylor's story prior to my book, he's a figure unknown to history because, well, I'm happy to get into why that is, but what he did and the things that he touched on in the World War II era, absolutely critical for the victory of World War II, the saving of Western civilization, absolutely essential that Myron Taylor lived and did what he did. but it's a story that was never told before in this book. Similarly, the Seward story, because as I say, this Lincoln bias has really not been told. And my next book is, again, a story that's never been told. So that's what excites me about writing these books, regurgitating a story that's been told 10, 15, 20 times. As I say, these 10,000 or 15,000 books on Lincoln, they're not really telling us anything that's really new about the man. If you really want to know a lot about Lincoln, again, read Mr. Burlingame's 2-volume book series on Lincoln.
So let's go back now to Seward. Let's go back to December 1860. Lincoln has just been elected. South Carolina has seceded. The sitting president says secession is illegal, but he can't do much about it. And then Seward, the man who just lost nomination, is essentially running a one-man rescue mission from the Senate floor. What did that look like?
So he came back to Washington recognizing that there was a vacuum. Lincoln was sitting back in Springfield, Illinois, saying nothing. Literally, he said nothing until he started on his trip to Washington later in February. He issued no public statements. And one historian calls this a period of, quote, masterful inactivity, which is an interesting way of saying putting a lipstick on a pig. Stewart recognized, on the other hand, that this was an existential crisis. Lincoln thought, and this is true, Lincoln believed that they'd heard all these threats about secession before. This was just a bunch of blowhards and this was all going to go away. But he really didn't know any of the players in Washington. He'd only been in Washington for one undistinguished term 10 years before. He didn't know any of the most important people in Washington. Seward knew all of these men, and he knew all the key players in the upper South states. Lincoln knew none of these men. So he knew how serious this was. So he comes back to Washington, recognizing that Lincoln is off in Illinois, which, again, this is before airplanes. This is Chicago and Springfield, Illinois are pretty far away from Washington, D.C. And he goes there and tries his best to use all of his tricks. And some of these aren't pretty. Some of it's dissembling, some of it's misleading people, some of it's leading them on to think he agrees with them more than he actually does. But his main purpose here is to give encouragement to the men, the leading unionists, particularly in North Carolina and Virginia, to encourage them to stay in the Union. And in this regard, he is highly successful. People don't realize this, but Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee all vote not to secede. People don't realize that. And this is really because of what Seward does in December, January, and February. And it's an amazing performance, which we can get into more detail, but even Michael Burlingame concedes, I think reluctantly concedes, that Seward was the dominant political force in Washington during these months. There's really no doubt about that.
You need to explain what happened here, because in 1850, he stood on the Senate floor and he declared that there was a higher law than the Constitution. In 58, he said the conflict was irrepressible. And then in January 1861, the same man, Seward, introduced a constitutional amendment to permanently protect slavery where it exists. So what happened to him?
Yeah, so his statement in 1850 actually earned him a very radical reputation, and particularly in the South, because once you say there's a higher law than the Constitution, the people in the South, particularly the slave owners who are looking to the Constitution to protect slavery, start to worry if there's some higher law than the Constitution, then they're coming for slavery. That earned Seward quite a radical reputation.
And what did you mean by that?
That he was in the foreground of the abolitionist movement. In other words, he wanted to destroy slavery.
And the higher law, what is it? Is it morality?
Yes. It's just there's something higher than something that's written down by men who affected a compromise, right? There's a morality. There's, again, these people who say it's immoral to come to terms or try to negotiate with slavery. He's saying that speech is given as an example that he agrees with that. That it's immoral, that he was in the opposition to the Compromise of 1850. He did not prevail, but that speech was very famous at the time. And that was a tag that stayed with him, even though he was not really a radical abolitionist. He never was that. The speech that you mentioned in 1858, he's talking about the economic systems of the two sections. He's talking about the free labor, capitalistic, entrepreneurial system of the North, which had produced great wealth and had encouraged a lot of social mobility and a lot of progress. The economic progress in the North, as we would see over the course of the Civil War, just completely dwarfed what was going on in the South. So what he's saying was the country, the two economic systems really don't mesh. This sort of feudal plantation system, which is not really very capitalistic, is a very different economic system than the Northern system. And that ultimately, as the country grows, according to his vision that we're going to go to the West Coast, one of these systems is going to win out and the other system is not going to win out. Now, he's not predicting a civil war or that we're going to come down and take your slaves. That's not what he's saying at all. What he's saying is these two economic systems ultimately, he's not saying 2 years from now, again, with the benefit of hindsight, we know that in 1861, war breaks out, but he's not talking about that in 1858. He's envisioning this taking several generations. That's what he's talking about. Even Lincoln, when he gave a similar speech in 1858 in his Senate race, the House divided speech, he wasn't talking about the House collapsing tomorrow or in a year. He was saying at some point in the distant future, the House will either be one way or another. So both those speeches by both men at around the same time in the late 1850s were talking about the same thing, although they were viewed very differently in the North than they were in the South. The South viewed them from a much more threatening way than the North. Now, when he comes in 1861 and gives, you reference the famous speech he gives on the floor of the Senate in front of an overflow crowd. If you're ever in the United States Senate, you know that 2,000 people don't fit in the United States Senate, but there are 2,000 overflow crowd of 2,000 people that listen to this speech. What he was talking about there was something that both he and Thurlow Weed, his political alter ego, the dictator of New York politics, had thought a lot about, which was the 1860 election had been won fair and square by the Republicans. And that issue was not allowing expansion of slavery into the territories, into the Western territories. And so this was basic Republican orthodoxy, is we're going to keep slavery where it is and not let it expand. And that over time, nobody knows when, but over time, when it's constricted to where it is, it will ultimately die out. Now, not in 5 years, not in 6 months, but generations. That was Republican standard orthodoxy. Once the Republicans win the election, both Seward and Thurlow Weed, analyzing this, say, okay, we've won that issue. And with a new administration run by Republicans, there cannot possibly be any expansion of slavery into the West come in the future. That's not going to happen. So let's try to give some olive branches give some conciliatory, we're not trying to kill you messages
Mm-hmm.
to the Upper South men who want to stay in the Union. And one of them is, let's have a constitutional amendment that protects slavery forever. Ultimately, what people don't remember is at 4:00 in the morning on March 4th, 1861, Congress passed the 13th Amendment. Now, it's not the 13th Amendment we know now, because this 13th Amendment was never approved by the states. But the 13th Amendment that was passed the morning of Lincoln's inauguration was exactly what Stewart had proposed, that slavery would never be interfered with in the states in which it existed. And Lincoln, in his inaugural address, made a marginal note. It's not in the printed version, but he wrote in his handwriting that he noted that this had passed several hours ago by Congress, and he was fully in support of it. Again, this wasn't such a controversial idea to let slavery stay where it was. It was the whole issue about letting it expand.
Let's now talk about the beginning of the Civil War and how he tried to prevent it. There is a meeting on April 4th, the same day Virginia voted against secession, 89 to 45, between Lincoln and a Virginia unionist, John Baldwin.
Yep.
And Stewart arranged it, right?
Yep.
Baldwin later claimed that Lincoln offered to evacuate Fort Sumter if Virginia Convention would adjourn. Lincoln denied it. What really happened in that room?
That, as I say in the book, that no one really knows. There are just a lot of different stories about these meetings that Lincoln had with especially Virginia unionists, not just the one that you referenced, but several others. A very famous meeting a couple of days before that, where Lincoln had told a former Virginia U.S. senator that he would gladly trade a fort for the Virginia. And that was a quote that Lincoln made, statement that he made. Obviously, he later changed it. If he was sincere in saying that, he later changed his mind. But these meetings with the Southern Unionists, I think, as best as I can tell you, is Lincoln had a different, Lincoln was not, as I say in the book, Lincoln was not completely on the same page as Seward, especially as March turned into April. He basically agreed with Seward to try to conciliate with the Upper South people in March. But then as March turned to April, he changed his mind. Now, there are a couple different reasons for that. But the basic thing I would say is Lincoln did not like the fact that the Union men he met from Virginia and North Carolina were what he called conditional unionists. They were for the Union, but with caveats. And the thing that he particularly didn't was the caveat of that if the North tried to, quote, coerce, close quote, the seceding states, that they would be honor bound to leave the Union. And he thought real Union men don't talk like that. You're either a real Union man or you're not. You're either for me or against me. And there's no halfway sort of thing. And so Seward was trying to convince Lincoln to thread a needle here. And the needle was give up Fort Sumter, which was strategically unimportant and militarily indefensible. I don't know, have you ever been to the Charleston Harbor? Anyone who's been to Charleston Harbor knows that Fort Sumter is militarily indefensible, and it had no military significance at all. But it was a hugely important symbol to the South, in particular to the people of South Carolina, which of course was the most fire-breathing of all the rebel states. They've been threatening to secede for 30 years, and now they finally had done it. So what Seward was trying to do was, let's give up Sumter. Who cares? Doesn't matter. We can't defend it anyway. and it's this huge symbol to the South, but at the same time, resupply another American fort called Fort Pickens, which is off the coast of Florida. It's militarily defensible, and it has great strategic value for patrolling the Atlantic coast, in particular when the Civil War breaks out, for blockading the South from sending cotton to France and England. Let's dump one, protect the other, which we can protect, and is strategically important. And at one point, Lincoln agrees with that. And then he changes his mind. And there's some reasons why I think he changed his mind. Lincoln never actually explained to anyone why he changed his mind, but he was under tremendous pressure. He was getting advice from all sorts of different sources. He was very mad at the head of the army, who tried to convince him to evacuate both forts. He threatened to fire General Scott for giving him political advice. That was one of the first times any of the people in Washington had ever seen Lincoln lose his temper. He literally blew his stack, and Lincoln very rarely lost his temper. That was something very unusual. Man under enormous stress, with very little training for the problems he was facing, not getting very good advice from a lot of people. I would not include Seward as giving him poor advice. I thought Seward's advice was very good. But he changes his mind. But it goes back to this, to your beginning question. He was hearing things from these unionists in the South, which he understood intellectually, but bothered him. I'm talking about him being Lincoln, bothered him in his gut. He said, this conditional union stuff, I just don't like that. You're either for us or against us. And he acted. So when Fort Sumter is fired upon, and of course the upper South states haven't seceded yet, he actually, when he called for troops, he called for troops from the upper South states as well. And as I point out in the book, that really sent them over the edge, because resupplying Fort Sumter is one thing, but asking them to supply troops to go fight the South Carolinians and the Georgians and the Floridians and the Alabamans and the Mississippians, that Virginia was not going to send troops to do that. North Carolina was not going to send troops to do that. Tennessee was not going to send troops to do that. But he asked them to send troops. He dug his heels in on this subject. And of course, he never lived to write his memoirs, and different people purport to speak for what Lincoln really intended or what he really meant to do. And of course, you have to take those with a grain of salt, because they were written 30 and 40 years after the events.
So let me play devil's advocate. And if Seward's approach could have prevented the war and 700,000 dead and maybe more now, the destruction of an entire region, it would have meant that he was protecting with 4 million people instead of slavery. How do you weight those two things?
I guess one thing, go back to what we were talking about before. I'm not trying to sit in a moral judgment here.
Okay.
What I'm doing is writing history based upon what people were doing at the time. Now, the basic premise of your question, is it moral to try to come to terms with and avoid a war which is going to lead to or cause 4 million African Americans to remain in slavery for some period of time? And what I would say to that is a couple things. One is, both Seward and Lincoln's main goal here was to save the Union. Lincoln once famously wrote to Horace Greeley, if I could save the Union by keeping all the slaves in slavery, I would do it. If I could keep the Union together by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing half the slaves and keeping the other half in bondage, I would do it. Now, maybe Lincoln didn't mean that, but that was his public position to Horace Greeley during the middle of the war, not at the beginning, in the middle of the war. So they were trying to save the Union and save this experiment in democracy, majoritarian rule. The other thing I would say is, let's be candid about what happened at the end of the Civil War. Yes, there were a number of constitutional amendments that were passed, which purported to free the slaves and give them the full benefits of American life. But in point of fact, that did not happen in the South. African Americans, yes, they weren't technically slaves anymore, but their lives, certainly for the next almost 100 years, were very difficult, to say the least. They were not granted full citizenship in these southern states. They were segregated under local law. They were denied the right to vote. They did not gain ability to partake in the American way of life or to have social mobility. The lynchings that went on of Black Americans in the 1930s and 1940s was horrific. They couldn't even get anti-lynching laws through the United States Congress in the 1940s. And this was at a time when record numbers of Black Americans were serving in the military, trying to save the country in an existential war with the Nazis and Japan. Talk about where's the moral conflict there, or the hypocrisy of that. Hypocrisy is nothing new, or moral conflicts are nothing new in American history. I guess my ultimate take on this is I'm not trying to resolve who's morally right or who should go to heaven or who shouldn't go to heaven. What I'm trying to do is have people, especially Americans, understand their history, something that Americans don't do. People don't study American history. They don't care about American history. My second book, which is about the worst Supreme Court decisions ever, Americans don't know anything about these decisions. They don't know that Franklin Roosevelt put 120,000 American citizens in concentration camps in World War II because we were at war. That's a horrible thing. And are we better off pretending it never existed? I don't think so. We're better off understanding what happened and why, so we can learn from that and maybe not do it again, especially in war, because war is a situation where people use that as a reason for all sorts of bad behavior. Lincoln's record on civil liberties in the Civil War was terrible. He put somewhere between 10 and 20,000 Americans in prison without the right of habeas corpus. This is the sainted Abraham Lincoln, who never did anything wrong and was morally perfect. He was a human being. He made mistakes. That was a big mistake.
Yeah.
We should know about it.
You spent years in Seward's head, right, through all the archival process. Do you think that he believed that the compromise would work, or do you think he was just trying to save time?
Oh, yes, I don't think he was on a fool's errand. I don't think he was doing this just to amuse himself or because he thought, who knows, there were periods where he thought this actually could work. And he really thought for example, once these votes in these states, Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, these were really incredible. These weren't like narrow margins. These were pretty significant votes by these people to stay in the Union. And he was also a practical politician. He recognized that as I point out in the book, Lincoln had only won with 39% of the popular vote. If the Republican Party was going to grow, because it virtually got no votes in the South in 1860, it had to expand its base. And so one of the things that he and this man I mentioned before, Thurlow Weed, were very focused on was changing the focus from slavery to union. And that there were people that the Republican Party, if it changed its focus to be the Union Party, and in 1864, that did change its name to the Union Party, we can bring in these people who used to be Whigs in North Carolina and Virginia and these other states, and they will respond and become part of the Republican Party. So he was thinking in political terms too. His focus was on the upcoming congressional elections in these various states. And if they could get Union candidates to be successful, that would really be very meaningful, especially if you could take away some of these, I'll call them distractions, like the Fort Sumter distraction, a military fort of no significance and completely indefensible. Why talk about that? Let's talk about something else which we can get some traction with. We're not going to get any traction threatening Fort Sumter. Plus, it's stupid. It's pointless. So let's talk about something that means something. So he was an eminently a practical fellow. Now, once Lincoln changed his mind, he saw that, okay, Lincoln, we're going to go to war now. So he went from plan A to plan B or plan D, or plan F. But he was very serious during these 4.5 months. And he wasn't just doing this
He believed that it could work.
No, he wasn't sure it was going to work, but the future of the country was at stake. And so he was trying to do his very best under incredibly difficult circumstances, which is all you can do. Maybe he was very smart. He had a very high IQ. He had a great belief in his ability to convince people and to manipulate people. And that's what he spent his time doing.
You've studied moment in American history when American institutions fail. Let's talk about the Dred Scott, the Korematsu, Plessy. You've also studied the moment when they self-correct. Brown versus Board, the Civil War Amendment, the Japanese internment redress. So from where you sit, does America self-correct? Or do people force the system to self-correct?
I'm often asked, am I pessimistic about the future or optimistic? And my take from that particular study, which turned into that book, leads me to be very optimistic. I think we do correct. I think our system, the Constitution, the court system, the judicial process in this country is constantly self-correcting. And that's one of the strengths of our system, strengths of our Constitution, strengths of our judiciary. And one of the themes of the book, as you point out, is over our history, the court, usually it's 9 people. These 9 people, unelected, can make horrible decisions, really horrible decisions. And it's not because they're necessarily evil people or trying to destroy the country. Believe it or not, when Chief Justice Taney wrote that the worst decision ever, the Dred Scott decision, which is really horrible to read. It is one of the most racist, disgusting.
Can you say a few words about it?
Yeah, that was a case where a slave who had been taken into free territory tried to use that as a basis to gain his freedom legally. And he brought several legal challenges, and it ultimately came up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court could have decided this on a very narrow basis, which lawyers would call a technicality, which is that he didn't have jurisdiction to bring a lawsuit in a federal court. Had the court just stopped there, it would have been a very unremarkable decision, and we would not be talking about it today. But Chief Justice Taney, believing this, I mean, it's hard to believe, but he really believed that by writing what he would soon write, this would solve the issue about slavery in the country and the issue would go away. He actually thought that would happen. It had the opposite effect. It ultimately led to the Civil War, but that's another story. So he goes on and says, I'm not going to stop there. I'm going to say that when Congress passed the Missouri Compromise to say that slavery could be expanded below the 36th parallel, but not above the 36th parallel, that was unconstitutional. That the Congress acted unconstitutionally. And it acted unconstitutionally because of a new doctrine he invented. He didn't call it this, but it later becomes known as this in other terrible Supreme Court decisions as substantive due process. Now, the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution is the due process amendment. And traditionally, when people think about due process, they think about a right to a fair trial, a right to a jury of your peers, things that have to do with process, that you would get the same type of justice that I would get. That's a process point or procedural point. He said, that's true, but in addition, I'm finding something in the Fifth Amendment that never existed before, which is a substantive right to take you as a citizen have a substantive right under the Due Process Clause to take your property wherever you want in the United States, however you define the United States. And what Chief Justice Taney meant by property, of course, he was talking about human beings. And so Congress could not prevent Southern slave owners who wanted to take their slaves to Minnesota or California or Oregon or Idaho or whatever. There's nothing they could do to stop that. Okay. He didn't even stop there. He then went on, and this is the hardest part of the decision to read, is why people don't want to talk about it, is he said, African Americans are not and can never be American citizens. Now, this is factually wrong because in numerous northern states in 1857, there are a lot of free African Americans walking around, American citizens voting and doing other things that American citizens can do. But he rules that no, with a broad brush fiat, all African Americans in slavery or not, none of those folks can be American citizens. So this is a really unbelievably terrible decision, which again, incredibly, he thought was going to solve the issue of slavery. But the people in the North, their heads just exploded. People like Seward and Lincoln thought that the Supreme Court was in a conspiratorial cabal with the Buchanan administration, which had just taken power a day or two earlier in 1857 to open up the entire country to slavery. And that when Lincoln and Stewart had talked about we're all going to be one or the other's now going to be, slavery is coming to Illinois, slavery is coming to New York, slavery is coming everywhere because of this decision. And again, this had a lot to do with people in the North getting their backs up and saying, what's going on here? We thought the 1850 compromise had solved this issue and slavery was going to stay where it was. This opens that all up. So incredibly terrible decision for a whole host of really bad reasons, as I've outlined. And the political consequences of this were, shall we say, quite dramatic. It led inexorably to the Spring Civil War.
I want to come back to an April 1 memo where Seward proposed that America declare war on France. I'm a Frenchman, so he wanted to declare war on my country to reunite your country. So the logic was manufacture a foreign crisis, rally national sentiment, make America forget that they're fighting each other. I cannot help noticing a parallel with what we are living at the moment, an administration right now that is picking up economic fights with virtually every trading partner on earth, tariffs on allies, tariffs on adversary, talk of annexing Greenland, as you mentioned, reclaiming the Panama Canal. Is it the same playbook? Use foreign confrontation to consolidate domestic power? Or do you see that as different from what we see today?
Completely different. This wasn't a new thought on April 1st. The memo, this famous memo he writes to the president. He had been talking about trying to pick fights, not start a war. There's a difference. Pick fights to change the subject. Remember, I was talking about domestically, he wanted to change the subject from slavery expansion to union. Here he's trying to change some of the subjects that were going on. But one of the things that was happening, remember the context here, a number, I think by this point, 7 of the cotton states had already seceded. They were making very serious efforts already to have France and England recognize the Confederacy as a nation state. One of the greatest things Seward did during the Civil War was prevent France and England from recognizing the Confederacy. Had they recognized the Confederacy, the South would have won the war. So pretty significant accomplishment by Seward there. But what was happening during this period was both England and France were testing the new administration and testing what they could do in the Western Hemisphere vis-a-vis, for example, you talk about France. France was taking some pretty aggressive steps and ultimately would take very aggressive steps in Mexico. So he was very concerned with that and stopping that. And ultimately we did stop that, not in 1861, but later in 1864 and 1865. But also Spain was going to be sending 5,000 troops to reestablish the Dominican Republic as a Spanish colony. That's inconsistent. That's inconsistent with the Monroe Doctrine, where we told European countries to stay out of our hemisphere. So there's that. England England had tremendous economic interests based upon Southern cotton, and they didn't want that interrupted. So Seward was not talking about starting wars, but he was wanting to put people on notice that we were aware of what was happening here. We were not going to stand by this and let it happen. Again, one of the things I talked about before with you with Fort Pickens, one of the reasons Fort Pickens is important is because it allows you to patrol the Florida coast, which leads into the Caribbean. So he's not a fair reading of that memo. And this is a very famous memo or infamous memo. Lots of people have different views of it, but I've tried to present as fairly as I can the historiography of everyone's views about this. But I think the fairest view of this is he's not saying let's declare war, but let's let France know we see what they're trying to do in Mexico, and we're just not going to allow that. And stern note to follow. And a stern note to follow did come. And as I mentioned, subsequently, the French government's attempts with Maximilian didn't work out so well for Maximilian, etc. He was a strict adherent to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine had been drafted by his hero, John Quincy Adams. He strongly believed in that. He strongly believed in keeping European influence, overt European influence, out of the Americas. And he also saw the corollary benefit of it uniting Americans around foreign nations trying to take advantage of America at a time when it was, to put it mildly, very vulnerable. Again, the country's falling apart. And here you have European colonial powers, France being one of them, clearly trying to take advantage of that. And he spends the first Lincoln term making it clear to the foreign colonial powers, France, Spain, England, that we're not going to just sit back and let them come back and establish a significant presence in the Americas. That's just not going to happen.
Okay.
So this is part of that effort.
I want to come back to what you said when you said you are an optimist and you believe that the system self-corrects itself. Today, we see with the current administration how much challenge this administration is putting on the system. You remain optimistic?
Oh, I do, particularly because I think what Chief Justice Roberts is trying to do on the court is very much misunderstood. If you only read certain newspapers on the East Coast of the United States, or only watched certain news channels which subscribe to a certain political view, you'd think the court had lost its mind and was just caving into everything that Trump wants. That's simply not.
So here, just to put words on what you said, if we read the New York Times or if we watch CNN, right?
Okay. Or MSNBC. I publicly predicted that Trump would lose the tariff issue. He's going to lose the birthright issue, in my view. He's not going to get everything he wants. And the Supreme Court, this is Chief Justice Roberts in particular, is a very much of an institutional person. He believes in the power of the court as a equal branch of government. So what he's doing in his current jurisprudence, which I think is a very good thing, again, one of the reasons I'm optimistic, is he's trying, and in my view, succeeding in rebalancing and bringing into better balance the three branches of government, the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive. So what his principal focus has been is to take back, not give, but take back authority from the executive branch, which has been given all this authority by Congress, really carte blanche authority, and say, Congress just can't pass 2,000-page bills that nobody knows what's in them and let these executive branches like the Labor Department or the EPA or whatever write thousands of pages of what Congress must have meant when Congress doesn't tell us what it meant. That's not democracy. Nobody elected these people in these executive branches. Nobody can fire them. No one can vote them out every 2 years or vote them in every 2 years. That's what democracy is about. So what he's trying to do is rebalance these and say to Congress, no, Congress, you got to do your job. Now, the example I give, you're too young to know this, but the example I give is in 1964 and 1965, when Congress passed the two most important civil rights bills of my lifetime. Every single person in Congress, and I'm not exaggerating, every single person in Congress knew what every word in those bills meant. They knew what every comma, what every semicolon, what everything meant. And when they voted on those bills, they knew exactly what they were doing. Compare that or contrast that with Nancy Pelosi passing the healthcare bill, 2,000 pages, and saying afterwards, we had to pass the bill in order to know what's in it. That's not democracy. How can you vote people in and out based upon they voted on a bill? We shouldn't vote for people who say, I'm going to vote for a bill, I don't know what's in it. That's ridiculous, but we do. And we let these people get away with it. But what Roberts is trying to do is say, no, Congress, you have to legislate. It's difficult, it's messy. Compromise is difficult, as the Seward book points out. But that's what this process, that's what democracy is. It's not necessarily pretty when you watch these things in action, but that's what our system is. So I think what's going on here is right. I think it's a good thing for the country. If the Supreme Court had agreed with Trump on the tariff thing, then I would agree with the New York Times. Then we have a king who's not accountable on anything, and let's just go home and call it a day. But that's not what the Supreme Court did. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not, the president can't cite some obscure law from 50 years ago and use that to just willy-nilly change the world trading system. That's not what the system is designed to do here. So that I think is a good decision, a precursor for what's more to come. That's not to say that Trump won't win some things in the Supreme Court, but he's going to lose some things. Overreaches. He doesn't necessarily have the best legal advice. And
so check and balance is working.
Yes. Yeah. And so and the other thing I would say is Constitution, again, is not perfect. It has some obvious flaws in it because it embraced the compromise with slavery, right? So the original sin of our country is slavery, and it's right there in the Constitution. Let's not ignore it. Let's talk about it and come to grips with it. But that's the bad side. The good side is the document and the subsequent amendments to it provide a framework that allow us to make decisions, correct bad decisions, go forward, and get on to the next thing, as opposed to being locked into some stupid, we're stuck in a corner and can't get out. That the Constitution has lots of what I call grease in its wheels that allows us to get by and do some other things and make changes. And even with these terrible decisions, which really are terrible, really shockingly bad, we're still here and we're doing okay. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you. Even Stewart, what is America to you?
It's my country. I think it's a shining example of the imperfect system of democracy. Winston Churchill once said it's the worst form of government ever, except for all the others. I think that's probably right. It's not perfect, but there's a reason why people keep coming here from other countries, wanting to come to this country as opposed to other places. It has the best judicial system in the world. It's still an engine of social mobility. Its educational processes, especially at the university level, are second to none. So it's a dynamic, open country, which is still open to new ideas and open to new people. And I think anything against that is a bad thing. Seward, the only thing that Seward ever disagreed with Lincoln on, believe it or not, was Lincoln thought the solution for the African Americans in this country was to send them all back to Africa, including the ones who were naturalized full American citizens. And Seward, after Lincoln died, he once told a colleague, that's the only thing I ever disagreed with on the president. He said, I always believed that if someone was here in this country, they had something to contribute, and we ought to embrace them as Americans and go forward. And so he embraced Irish Catholics. He embraced people from all over Eastern Europe. He was a leading advocate for the Underground Railroad. He believed in expanding America with people from other places. So he's one of the original optimists of America, that this is a better place where people can get ahead if they work hard. And that's why people want to come here. So I think it's a great place. But we're not perfect. But if we don't know our history, then that's a bad thing. So what I'm trying to do is let's confront some part of our history that people don't like to talk about, but we should know about, because we'll be better for it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If this episode was interesting to you, share it with a friend or a family member who might want to hear it too. And if you have a minute, please leave us a rating at rate.backinamericathepodcast.com. Ratings are how podcasts get discovered. They push the show higher in search results and recommendations, which bring in new listeners. It is the single most useful thing you can do to support Back in America.